So a while ago, I made a video touching on some of America's scrapped steam locomotive excursion stars. Considering how well the video had done, and by popular demand, here's your part 2. Yes, I'm afraid that person was very persistent that this video should be made. So today, we'll be taking a look at 5 more steam excursion stars that aren't with us anymore. If you haven't watched the previous video yet, I highly recommend you do, especially if you're looking for the more well-known stories like Grand Trunk 5629. If you already have, well then that's great. Just to give you a refresher, for this list we'll be looking at locomotives that were originally set aside for preservation and have pulled at least one excursion before or after retirement. We're excluding locomotives like Texas and Pacific 638, as it was set aside for preservation, but only as a static display at the Dallas Fair Park, and later scrapped due to vandalism. With that cleared up, let's get going down the list.
Number 5. The Southern Pacific 4274. This locomotive was an honorable mention in the last video, but now here she is in her own segment. Now, 4274, like a lot of cab forwards, was a simple solution to a big problem. Lots of railroads had tunnels to channel through many mountain ranges, and the Southern Pacific was no exception, having not only a lot of tunnels on their system, but some of the longest ones too. One of them, Tunnel Number 41, also known as the Big Hole on the Roseville Subdivision in Norton, California, is over 10,325 feet long. Of course, when you go through that with a steam locomotive, the smoke builds up on the roof and the crew can choke on fumes that obscure their view. The giant blind spot in the front of the boiler didn't help either. Some Southern Pacific crews even ran their locomotives backwards, often to try and alleviate the issue, but some steam locomotives couldn't go too fast in reverse without derailing, and you still had that visibility problem thanks to the tender. So, to solve that problem, the cab forward was invented. By putting the smokestack behind the cab, and not only freed the crew from getting a black lung at every tunnel, but they got a much better view, much like today's cab cars on commuter railroads. While Southern Pacific didn't come up with the idea for the cab forward, as that credit belongs to Manage in Forney, the Southern Pacific was the railroad to use the cab forwards the most and were quite well known up there. There were many different models made up, but the one we'll focus on today is the AC-11. The AC-11s were built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Eddystone, Pennsylvania from November 1942 to April of 1943, numbered 4245 to 4274. Perfect timing to pull freight for the war effort. Just like the other cab forwards that came before it, they were used on heavy freight trains and occasional passenger trains, with places like Donner Pass being a common area to see them thunder up steep grades. Of course, though, like the other designs, cab forwards like the AC-11s weren't perfect. Yes, they had better vision and didn't suffocate the crews in the tunnels, but they also exposed the crew in terms of a head-on collision, while the conventional steam locomotive, the boiler would take the brunt of it. Not that it made much difference, but whatever. Also, oil leaks from pipes that ran from the tender to the firebox were another issue, causing wheel slip among other problems. But their biggest issue had nothing to do with their design. They just came very late in the steam age, being built in the 1940s. By the time World War II was over, railroads were already looking at dieselization, and the Southern Pacific was certainly one of them. Even though they were powerful and modern, diesels still suffocate on their own exhaust. At least until the tunnel motors were invented. 4274 and her sisters would be retired in 1956 after less than 15 years of service. While her sisters rotted away in scrapyards, 4274 was fired up one last time for a farewell steam excursion the very next year, over its former stomping grounds, Donner Pass. Sadly, when the excursion was over, 4274 was scrapped that very same year, making the AC-11 class extinct. It's such a shame she met such an end after such a great excursion. But the Southern Pacific was convinced to save at least one cab forward, and that being AC-12 Class 4294, which is on static display at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, California, and as of today is the only Southern Pacific cab forward left in existence. There are talks about getting it operational, however, due to costs and lack of areas to run it, such a project will not be moving forward anytime soon, but operational or not, it's great one still exists.
Number 4. New Haven 3016. Ah, the New Haven. A railroad that couldn't catch a break. Neither could this engine. This Mikado was an ALCO product from Schenectady Works built in 1916 as a Class J1 for the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, or simply just a New Haven. 25 in total were built, numbered 3000 to 3024, with 8 more being built later as Class J2s, numbered 3100 to 3107. These engines were mainly used in freight service, having a pretty uneventful career. After World War II, the New Haven looked toward purchasing diesels, but in 1948, the 3016 led one of the few farewell steam excursions run by the New Haven. When it was originally retired, 3016 and a sister engine, 3020, were set aside for an interesting job. Not a stationary boiler generator, not being turned into a boat. They were set aside for snow removal. This, however, isn't 100% confirmed, so take such information with a grain of salt. But what we do know as fact is 3016 also got some time on the big screen. In 1959, quite some time after being retired by the New Haven, the 3016 appeared in the American romantic comedy film It Happened to Jane, as Eastern in Portland 97. Take a wild guess what the number was referencing.
Raring to go, eh? Yeah. Say, isn't old 97 a little dated? Dated? She's better than those coffee pots they're using now. She's got a boiler that'll give you 350 pounds of pressure as long as you ask her. Ah, she's a lively girl, mister.
The engine was in quite a few scenes around the state of Connecticut. The film was originally titled named Miss Casey Jones, until being renamed during production to That Jane from Maine, and finally, It Happened to Jane. The film was released in 1961 as Twinkle and Shine, but anytime you search that, it takes you back to the original 1959 title. Okay, let's not get too far off the track. Tragically though, despite her newfound stardom on the big screen, several attempts to preserve the engine, even by the New Haven itself, had all failed, and the locomotive was cut up by 1961. It's said that not only 3016 was cut up, but the fact that none of New Haven's steam locomotives could be preserved.
Bully.
However, a replica of 3016's class does still run today. That replica is Valley Railroad 3025, located at Essex, Connecticut. The locomotive was originally one of 3 Chinese-built SY-class Mikados built at the Tangshan Locomotive and Rolling Stock Works in 1989, exclusively for tourist operations in the United States, since by then, China was still building and using mainline steam. It went to the Knox and King Railroad as 1658 until it went bust in 2008, becoming a rail trail in 2010. It was then purchased by the Valley Railroad, where it was reworked and renumbered as New Haven 3025, making it unofficially the 26th New Haven J1 class. It's still operating excursions today, continuing the legacy of 3016 and her sisters, even if it's just a Chinese engine in disguise.
Number 3. The Illinois Central's 2613. This is the story of a mountain that had every right to be preserved, but in the end, no one wanted it. 2613 was a 2600 class 482 mountain built by the Illinois Central's Paducah, Kentucky shops in 1943, being the 14th of 20 class members. These were among the most powerful mountain-type locomotives ever built. 2613 and her sisters were assigned to pull freight trains from Chicago to East St. Louis and Cairo, and in later years, they operated on the IC's primary route between Chicago and Memphis, Tennessee. After dieselization, 2613 was subsequently reassigned to operate in the St. Louis division, where many coal mines the railroad served were located. A natural environment for most steam engines until even that section was dieselized. Later that year, after being put into storage, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which had already retired all of their steam locomotives by then, was looking to run an engine they could use to pull an excursion to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their first passenger train. The IC agreed to lease 2613 to the LNN, and after a quick paint and repaint at the Paducah shops, she pulled the 15-car Centennial train on October 24th from Louisville, Kentucky to Nashville, Tennessee, with 850 people on board. The run was successful, albeit 2613 almost ran out of coal. After the Centennial run, number 2613 returned to Paducah with a freight train in tow, and the IC had planned to put the locomotive back into storage. That is, until a boost in coal traffic in the Kentucky division occurred. IC decided to return some of their steam locomotives to service, and on October 28th, 2613 pulled coal trains around Paducah alongside a few others, such as 210-2 2807, and later 210-2s 2739, 2802, and 482 number 2524. By the end of March of 1960, all steam locomotives in the Kentucky division were put back into storage again at Paducah. The story doesn't end there, as on May 14th that year, 2613 pulled the Bluegrass Safari, a sightseeing excursion sponsored by the Rail Museum Safaris, and it toured the IC between Louisville and Paducah. At Paducah, passengers were allowed to tour the IC shops and roundhouse, where 2739 was fired up as a backup power for whenever 2613 broke down, but the need never arose. On October 2nd, 2613 pulled yet another excursion between Louisville and Dawson Springs, as it was sponsored by the Louisville chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. Now, what happened next is still debated. In late 1961, the IC decided to scrap all their remaining steam locomotives since they claimed to make more money by selling the remains as scrap to scrap dealers. The Kentucky Railway Museum of Louisville began negotiating with the IC to acquire the 2613, with several members traveling to Chicago to meet with IC management. IC, however, was more interested in selling the locomotive for scrap. The museum, which had only been formed a few years prior, couldn't raise enough money to meet the scrap price, and by January 1962, 2613 and all of her remaining sisters were cut up in Paducah. Some have said, though, that the IC put the engine up for sale and the Kentucky Railway Museum declined it for a lack of room. I've heard convincing arguments for both, but who really knows? For some reason, the tenders from the 2600s were spared and put into storage after their locomotives were scrapped, including 2613s. Later, a Chicago area rail fan by the name of Richard Jensen acquired 2613's tender along with the one from her sister 2612. He moved them to the Chicago, West Pullman, and Southern Railroad for storage. He had plans to use both tenders with Burlington 4963 and 5632 in excursion service.
Here we go again.
But financial difficulties in the 1970s made him fall behind on rent to store the tenders. And as a result, in 1981, the railroad gave up on collecting rent from Jensen and acquired the tenders, and ex-Mississippi Eastern 460-303 as compensation. They sold the tenders and 303 at an auction to William Latham of Rockford, Illinois. Latham had big plans to create a small railroad museum with the locomotives and tenders as exhibits, but this plan fell apart, with 303 eventually going to the Monticello Railway Museum in June of 2000. A Monticello member tried to save at least one of the tenders from the Rockford collection for preservation, but efforts failed and both tenders were scrapped by 2011, meaning it took a full 50 years for 2613 to be scrapped entirely. Well, at least the tender is reunited with 2613 now. And finally, in the spring of 1996, a team of mural artists from Lafayette, Louisiana, led by Robert Dafford, painted murals on the downtown Paducah floodwalls to address Paducah's history. And one of those murals is dedicated to 2613 and its final runs in 1960, ensuring that she is not forgotten.
Number 2. Pennsylvania Railroad 612. I really wanted to put this as number 1. Not just because it's a Pennsylvania Railroad K4. Okay, fine, kind of. But the real number 1 was just too good to play second fiddle, and you'll see why. The Pennsylvania Railroad K4 probably needs little introduction, but for those that don't know, the Pennsylvania Railroad K4 was the Pennsy's main passenger locomotive and probably their most well-known of their steam locomotives. It also happens to be my favorite steam locomotive of all time. Look at them 80-inch drivers. An amazing 425 of these locomotives were built between 1914 to 1928, with the majority being built in the Pennsylvania Railroad's own Juniata shops in Altoona, Pennsylvania, who built 350 of them. But some were also built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Eddystone, Pennsylvania, of which they built 75 of them. Once they were out of the factory gates, they proved their worth on fast passenger service all across the Pennsylvania system. You name that kind of passenger service, from small commuter trains, even those on the Long Island, all the way to pristine mainline express trains. You name it, you'd very likely see a K4 doing it. They even took a freight train or two. Kind of an unusual sight, but they had interchangeable parts and tenders with the L1 class Mikados on freight, and they were only used on freight when needed, which was pretty rare in itself, but whatever. The K4s were so successful that they even influenced other locomotive designs, not just those of other Pennsy locomotives, but even worldwide, as a certain London and Northeastern Railway chief mechanical engineer by the name of Sir Nigel Gresley incorporated much of the boiler design, including the tapered shape, into his famous Class A1 Pacific. That's right, the A1 Pacific, including the world's famous Flying Scotsman, and Gordon if you're a Thomas fan, owes part of its existence to the Pennsylvania Railroad K4. You're welcome. The major differences, barring the obvious design choices and loading gauge between British and US steam, is the lack of a bell pair firebox, as Gresley preferred round tops. Still, the bell pairs were quite popular in other British steam. They also outlasted two of their original replacements, being the K5s, which crews didn't get too fond of and had only a 10% boost in performance, and the T1s, which, as we all know, had a nasty habit of wheel slip and being tough on curves. The K4 was also the poster child of many company-based tests on new technologies for steam, including streamlining, of course, in the form of the Pennsylvania Railroad torpedo, and other designs from industrial designer Raymond Loewy, not to mention the semi-streamlined skyline casing on K4 1188, counter-cross-balance disc drivers, smoke deflectors, also known as elephant ears, trailing truck boosters, poppet valves, and other upgrades. A subclass of the K4s, the K4SAs, had multiple modifications compared to their original design, such as 15-inch piston valves, higher steam domes, taller circulators, and front-end throttles. Only 5 received this subclass classification: 1985, 5405, 5481, 5484, and 612, the one we'll be focusing on. I could talk a lot more about the K4's history, but as much as I want to, the video wouldn't be done otherwise. 612 was a June 1917 build from Altoona. This particular K4 was commonly found on the New York and Long Branch Division, running between South Amboy to Bayhead Junction in New Jersey, alongside G5460s and E6 Class 442 Atlantics. This soon became one of the Pennsylvania Railroad's last stronghold for steam, especially for the K4s, as the Pennsy could only resist diesel technology for oh so long. In 1957, the Pennsylvania Railroad retired the last of their steam fleet. However, 612 was chosen to pull a farewell excursion sponsored by the Branford Electric Railway Association in October of 1957. The excursion went from Penn Station down the main line, then to the Perth, Amboy, and Woodbridge branch, being towed by an unknown GG1. Then, under her own power, 612 pulled the excursion to Seagirt on the New York and Long branch, up the Freehold branch to Jamesburg, and over the Amboy branch back to South Amboy, before being pulled back to New York Penn by electric power, likely by another GG1. Sadly though, when the Pennsy was choosing what steam locomotives to preserve, shockingly 612 wasn't one of them. Instead, for the K4s, the Pennsy chose to save 1361 and prototype 1737, which was found to be in poor condition and was swapped out for 3750.
I am a master of disguise.
Both were later designated as Pennsylvania State Steam Locomotives. Ah, the perks of living in this state. 612, though, was sadly cut up after 1958. And all that survives of 612 today is her number plate, which is currently owned by Edward Kaspersky, pictured here. The legacy of 612, though, is also still carried on by her siblings 1361 and 3750. 3750 being on display at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg, and 1361, who's being restored as of the making of this video to operational condition by the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, Pennsylvania. If you want to help with donations to get 1361 running again, please, by all means, check out the link in the video description. And even if you can't donate, please spread the word the best you can. I myself have even donated a good chunk of change in this restoration. Now I know what you're thinking. If a Pennsylvania Railroad K4 couldn't make number 1, then what possibly could? Well, before we answer that, let's list some honorable mentions. Southern Pacific 4443, a daylight 484 that pulled one of the final steam excursions on the Southern Pacific in 1957, only to be scrapped the next year, all because her sister, 4449, was at the front of the scrap line and easiest to move. Northern Pacific 1372, a 460 that operated on an excursion from Seattle in December of 1956, followed by 2 more in 1957. It was scrapped shortly thereafter. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 6315, an M4A Class 210 Ford Texas that double-headed with 5632 on an excursion into September of 1959. The big Colorado met a tragic end when it damaged its valve gear at speed, leaving 5632 to manage the rest of the journey solo without further incident. 6315 was put in a deadline and scrapped by 1964. If you want a third installment, namely with that last honorable mention, which has a lot more to the story, let me know down below in the comments. But now, let's move on to the number 1 pick.
Number 1. Timken 1111. That's right, the Timken 4 Aces is the number 1. How fitting. Now what on earth could this engine be doing on this list? Well, the story is one that we cannot refuse to ignore. Well, better break down the history lesson. Before World War II, axle bearings were simply brass journals that spun in place. These would be lubricated by a grease and cotton packing to cool the bearing. This oil would need to be topped up every few thousand miles, otherwise the bearing would run dry, overheat, and eventually seize, emitting smoke and sometimes flames out of the journal box, in what was known as a hot box. If this wasn't taken care of, the bearing can break, causing a derailment. The Timken company introduced the idea of having a bearing that just floated on a cushion of rollers to do away with traditional journals. While Santa Fe tried the bearings out first on their passenger trains with success, the Timken company needed to push this even further to prove to the industry their rollers were superior to the friction bearings. So in 1930, Timken contracted ALCO to produce the Timken 484-1111, nicknamed 4 Aces. Not only was this the first locomotive to be built with roller bearings on each axle, it was one of the only privately owned mainline steam locomotives to be built in the world. Being a superpower steam engine, it also featured a lot of new and high-quality technologies for steam locomotives at that time, provided by over 52 contractors such as a Worthington feedwater heater and a Franklin booster on the trailing truck. The locomotive toured many railroads to show off its roller technology in different services, such as pulling a 10,000-ton coal drag on the Chesapeake in Ohio spanning 132 cars, a 3-minute early 12-car heavyweight passenger train over the Pennsylvania Railroad through the Allegheny Mountains without helpers, and many more roads in the Northeast. There were even publicity events where a team of people could pull the 4 Aces by rope to demonstrate how much easier it was to move without the excess friction of journal boxes. The engine wasn't perfect though, as the engine was a little bit more slippery when starting. since not as much power was needed to start a heavy train, but at speed it wasn't an issue. Upon testing on the Northern Pacific, however, things would take a bad turn, and it wouldn't be just because of the railroad's preference of burning lower-grade bituminous coal. While pulling the NP's North Coast Limited at speeds of over 88 miles an hour, the locomotive suffered severe crown sheet damage due to the water level being dropped too low. Thankfully, the locomotive didn't explode, but now the firebox roof had warped downward, dampening performance. To make matters worse, Northern Pacific had a strict policy to not repair engines they didn't own, and Timken wasn't interested in fixing their own engine anymore since their point was now made across all railroads who were switching to rollers. Northern Pacific eventually said, "Oh, what the hell," and bought the engine themselves in 1933, becoming Northern Pacific's sole A1 class, number 2626, and making the necessary repairs. The engine would be put in passenger service between Seattle and Yakima, Washington, then shifted its service to passenger trains between Seattle and Missoula, Montana. It ran for 23 years before being retired from service. Its last run was on August 4th, 1957, when it pulled an excursion from Seattle to Cle Elum, Washington, and back again. Because of its historical significance, efforts were made to save the engine, including from the Timken company themselves, wanting to repurchase the engine and return it to the company's Canton, Ohio headquarters under its own steam. But tragically, it was scrapped in 1958 before Timken and Northern Pacific could complete negotiations. While the engine itself was gone, the contributions it left behind cannot be overstated. The Timken company to this day still produces roller bearings for railroads across America, and many modern steam locomotives would be built with roller bearing stock, many being in excursion service today. Some locomotives and rolling stock that came with journal boxes even had their journal boxes switched out for rollers to increase reliability, including those being rebuilt to newer types, such as the Reading I-10SAs when being converted to T1484s in the 1940s. Of course, if you look hard enough, many equipment on tourist railroads still have journal boxes, but journal box cars would be banned from interchanging with Class 1 railroads by the FRA in 1998. Compared to other modern implements such as cap signals, positive train control, or even the end-of-train device, the switch from friction bearings to rollers was gradual, but still changed railroad history forever. And although the Four Aces didn't exactly introduce the idea to the industry, it did prove the worthiness to invest in smoother running, so, preserved or not, the engine's legacy echoes on for centuries to come.
While thousands of steam locomotives have since been lost to the winds of history, many would see the luck of excursion service or find a new lease on life. But even fewer would still survive today, whether operational or as a static display, though we should be grateful for what we have today and what could possibly come in the future. Thanks for watching this video. I'd like to thank the Texas Hot Rail, PensyFan19, Train Guru, and Ryan's Colorado Rail Productions for collaborating with this video as additional voices, as well as those who provided photos, videos, and Trainz Z models of the engines featured in this video, including Trainz Forge in particular for the Timken 1111 models. Although the pack isn't available to the public and I've only managed to get it to work in Trainz A New Era, as I couldn't get it to work in 19, there's like some dependency issues or something like that. It is being remastered, so I've been told, so be sure to keep an eye out, and be sure to check out some of their other stuff. They have some good stuff on their website. As always, thanks for watching, we'll see you next time.